Welcome to Convos from the Couch by Lifestance Health, where leading mental health professionals help guide you on your journey to a healthier, more fulfilling life. Hello, everyone. This is Convos from the Couch by Lifestance Health. I'm Nicolette Lienza, and on this episode, I'll be talking with Paula Bamgbose-Martins, a child, couples, and family trauma therapist from one of our Philadelphia offices, and she will help us to understand more about intergenerational trauma. So welcome back, Paula. Great to have you on.
Thank you for having me. Very excited for this conversation.
Yeah, oh my gosh, so am I. You know, intergenerational trauma, or sometimes it's also called generational trauma, it can have such profound impact on individuals, families. And so I really look forward to our conversation today about it, how it manifests and how it can be addressed as well. So thank you again for being on.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
So we're going to go ahead and get started. And let me throw out the very first question here for you, which is, can you explain what intergenerational trauma is and how it differs from other forms of trauma?
Right. So intergenerational trauma, or like you said, generational trauma, and I believe it's also called multi-generational trauma. It's all the same. The point of it is the generation aspect of the trauma that makes it already different from other forms of trauma, because it's trauma that's passed from generation to generation to generation of obviously family trees. You can also look at it as, let's say, the initial survivor of the trauma passing it down to their descendants. So that can just be a specific parent. Doesn't necessarily have to be both, as long as it's just one parent who's passing that down. The thing with intergenerational trauma is the fact that it looks just like trauma, because that's what it is, right? And it's like, it looks like PTSD, it looks like anxiety, it looks like emotional dysregulation, it looks like mood dysregulation, poor communication skills, having porous or very rigid boundaries. But typically I would even gear towards more so porous boundaries, because the notion and idea of family comes with like a sense of obligation from the beginning in that type of relational dynamic. So with a family system that already comes with the sense of obligation from the beginning, you're born to be obligated to be a sibling to your sister and things like that, right? The lack of boundaries, it's more so porous than rigid, because it's usually, if you have conversations with people, they will tell you it's harder to set boundaries with their family as opposed to people that are strangers.
Right.
So I would definitely say that intergenerational trauma looks more like porous boundaries. And of course, if we're going to talk about why it's different from other forms of trauma, you could also look at what causes intergenerational trauma. That's one. And then another thing that you could look at too as well is how it actually affects us. So the first part being the cause. If I'm being honest, in coming into our conversation today, I was like, oh my, I didn't realize that there was even more causes than I thought there were. But it kind of made sense. It made so much sense. And it also tied back to the previous podcast episode you and I had, where we talked about identities, and a lot of the trauma that stems from the root of intergenerational trauma comes from historical trauma, as we all know. Things like being a descendant of refugees, Holocaust survivors, colonialism, racism, war. So because even slavery too as well.
Yeah.
So because of the fact that that is like the root, you see why it's hard. Like when you look at the generational aspect of the trauma, it's like this very hard thing to shake off compared to, let's say, if someone talked about, and this is not to differentiate or negate the fact that trauma is trauma, but if we're comparing it to, let's say, someone who may have had an acute traumatic experience where, let's say, they got into a car accident, comparing that to something along the lines of intergenerational, you might still have the same approach with healing from that trauma, but the level of work that's going
Yeah.
to happen for the generational trauma is different. So that already makes it very different from other forms of trauma.
I'm glad you bring up that point. I think that's actually a really key point. I also wanted to circle back because you talked about porous boundaries that families might have, which is actually one of the things, we look at of how intergenerational trauma can manifest in families. But can you go a little bit more into what porous boundaries are for people who might not be familiar with that term?
Yeah, so porous boundaries is pretty much just poor boundaries. So
Okay.
it looks like oversharing. It looks like not having the ability to say no. For example, it looks like people pleasing behavior. Yeah, that's one.
That's a big one.
It also looks like a level of, how do I put this? A level of a script a script that we develop for ourselves to justify why that is not. So I'll give you an example. A client of mine who I actually saw this week was explaining to me how a friend of his for 3 years now has consistently called during times of the day when he's busy and he's with his family and he needs to do things that are his responsibility. And he's communicated to them, like, not directly, just said, yeah, can you call me at another time? But would pick up a lot of times when the friend would call him. And of course, next thing, something recent happened where he got tired, but he hadn't set those boundaries with this friend. So the friend calls, he just ignores. The friend calls, he ignores. And then eventually the friend gets angry and doesn't speak to him. So he comes to therapy and he's saying, it's my fault, meaning it's his fault that he did not pick up the call, as opposed to it's my fault that I did not set the
Ah,
boundary with my
right,
friend. Because
right.
for him, he sees that as, and like, I have no choice but to pick up the call when this person calls. But because I'm not, I'm afraid of conflict, which you would see in family dynamics too as well. I'm afraid of conflict, it would be easier to say that it's my fault. So that would be an example of what porous boundaries look like.
Oh my gosh, that's a great example. Can you share with us other ways that this type of trauma can manifest in individuals or families?
Yeah. So the thing with that is there's a lot of emotional dysregulation that comes with intergenerational trauma. I think if I look at my experience with my clients who have some level or some degree of intergenerational trauma, it's like, oh, okay, makes sense. I see what's happening. So there's a lot of unresolved emotions and thoughts. Very deep resentment too as well can absolutely manifest. One very common one is a negative repeated pattern of behavior. So, for example, I don't know if you know, like, the terminology like hush culture, something like that. So whereas we don't speak about this thing that
Right.
clearly is a problem in our family. So of course you might see some generations of abuse happening with women specifically in the family, and no one says anything. I had a client who had talked about they picking up on the generational, like, the negative repeated patterns of behavior of a specific member of the family always being killed by a loved one or being killed by someone. And I was like, that's an interesting line to actually, like, that's interesting observation when they have brought this to me. So that repeated pattern of behavior it can be in different ways, but it's still very similar. And I would say another thing too as well, unfortunately, when we talk about generational trauma, is the poor parent-child relationship,
Yeah.
where a lot of us as adults were manifesting attachment styles that mimic
Oh,
what our childhood
right.
was,
Right.
was like. So that already in its own can be a topic on its own.
That's a whole, right? That's a whole
So
other episode.
those are very big indications of generational trauma when we're looking at how it can actually manifest.
Now, have you come across, I think in some of my own clients that I've identified generational trauma. Uh, for some, I'll see a mistrust that the family will have for just people outside of the family. This just basic
Mm,
mistrust. Have you noticed that as well?
what do you mean when you say that?
So, okay, one of the examples I'm thinking of is I used to work in foster care. And
Mm,
sometimes, we know in foster care, foster youth have been exposed to trauma. And
mm,
part of the goal of foster care is reunifying back with parents or family and
mm,
because of the system per se. So even looking at children's
mm,
protective services, I'll find some families, even with reunification, will be just very
mm,
not trusting. And then the play of the generational trauma too, where generation to generation of maybe abuse and neglect and trauma playing
mm.
out. So that's where I'll see probably just more of a mistrust of the system is probably more of how I'm
Yeah,
describing that. Does that make sense?
yeah, absolutely. During the time when I was solely working with kids and their caregivers, I saw that all the time. It was very common where I would have kids who wouldn't even trust me because they would look at me as the system too as well.
I've
And
been there.
I could have mom come in who has maybe a ruptured attachment with the kid, but would also be distrusting of the system. So they're both what they share, the trauma that they share in common is the mistrust of the system in itself. And then looking at it too as well, because it does absolutely impact that relationship. Because a lot of times, if we're going back to the causes of the trauma, that
Mm-hmm.
the marginalized groups and
Yep.
identities are formed from that trauma. So, of
Right.
course, if we're looking at it from that perspective, it makes sense as to why even looking at the mistress of the system as a shared common trauma, the relational aspect of it, the generational aspect of it is just they connect. There's a connection there.
Right. Right. Let me ask you this. How can understanding generational trauma help us better to support those who've experienced it?
That question, for some reason, is a tough one.
So I agree that is a tough question, right? I mean, here we are having this
that is
lovely
a tough one.
conversation, right? We're having the conversation about it, and you and I are both coming from the
Mm,
point of view of knowing what it looks like working with individuals and families,
yeah.
um, but I think one of the keys, and we were talking a little bit about this before we were recording, is that my hope is for some listeners to realize, like, wow,
Mm,
this is a thing, and maybe this is
mm,
something in my own life that I've been experiencing, and my family has as well.
mm,
So. I think even for individuals, understanding that this is a type of trauma that might be a dynamic in your family, it could
yeah.
just be helpful right there. Or if
Yeah.
you're somebody outside the family looking at the family, that might be another way of, like, I think when you understand
Mm,
something, you can better
yeah.
support it. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
it makes sense. The reason why this is a tough one is because I don't know how the listeners are going to feel about my answer to that.
Oh, I'm curious. All right, what's your answer here?
I honestly, this is just coming not from a professional point of view, but maybe a little bit of that of like looking at the world. But I think as long as there's a family line, there's trauma, if that makes sense. So as long as there's a family system there, there's going to be trauma. Of course, the trauma is it's going to range in terms of severity, frequency, who's responsible for it, what type of trauma it is. But as long as there's a family dynamic, it can even be as, and I say minute because, but it's also not minute for some people. That's their trauma.
Right.
The
Right.
expectation to be perfect, for example,
Yeah.
the trauma of we present ourselves this way. If you present yourself very differently, it's almost like a disgrace to the family. I've had clients where that was their trauma. And for someone might be like, yeah, but it's made your dad successful, it's made your mom successful, it's made you successful. So what's the trauma? And they're like, I don't know how to stop.
Right,
Like,
right,
they would
right.
tell me, like, I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to pause and rest and be mindful and be present in life. That is a trauma. So I
Hmm.
think the reason why that was my thought when you
I
asked that
see.
question is the
Okay.
fact that we have to be made aware. Like you can't really fix or address what you're not necessarily made aware of. And I think because there's also a hush mentality with generational trauma, because
Hmm.
it has to do with families, and families have different makeups, they have different cultures around what their dynamic looks like. So it's understandable that this is not a conversation that we're having, but it should be a conversation that we have, and we need to normalize it.
Yes.
Normalize it in the sense where
Yeah.
we're not talking about this because mom did something wrong, or granddad did something wrong, or grandmom did something wrong. Now, bear in mind, I'm not talking about people who've actually gone through severe levels of abuse, where a family member was responsible for that. Those people are wrong, if that makes sense.
Right,
But
right,
more
right.
so coming from the perspective of, okay, I understand, makes sense why you parented me this way because that was what you experienced.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, the reason why the awareness aspect most likely is very, very low is because I have a lot of, like, I see it every day in my sessions where it's, if I say this would happen. If I set that boundary with my parents, this would happen. If I had that conversation with them, that this happened, because there's a block within that power dynamic of, I did the best that I could, but I don't want to sit to have to realize what trauma did I actually experience that I passed on. Because that
Hmm.
then comes self accountability. And that is one of the things that we really struggle with as
Right,
humans.
right. Very true. You made a point a little earlier saying if I'm paraphrasing, if you're in a family dynamic, what comes hand in hand with that is trauma, some sort of line of trauma. And I think that's a really interesting statement. And I agree with that. And part of it too is I'm a trauma therapist, a specialist. So I feel like I see it day to day as I'm working with my
Mm-hmm.
own clients. But
Mm-hmm.
I think it's one of those notions that people don't really recognize. That if you're part
Yeah.
of a family dynamic, there's probably some semblance of a line of trauma just inherent in that. Is that a fair way of how you're
Yeah.
describing it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right when you say that you think that people just don't recognize that.
Right.
And I honestly don't blame them. I have more empathy for them in my sessions when that happens. I don't blame them because it it changes the idealistic view that you also have of your family, if that makes
Oh,
sense.
good point. Oh,
For
I didn't look at it
and
from that point of
it's
view. Yeah.
And I think us, whether we're adults, we're older generation, mid to late generation, whatever generation we're in, we're always still kids at heart. So if
Hmm.
something changes, that the idealistic view that you maybe had of a parent or anyone, any family member, really, it becomes shocking to the point where no one really wants to have to sit with that emotion, because that's when it's real, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Right. Oh, for sure. For sure. And sitting with those emotions can just feel so uncomfortable, which is why I think
Mm,
it drives people to want to avoid feeling that, or maybe even
yeah,
turning to substances to numb it and things like that.
yeah, exactly. Currently in my life, I'm having these kind of conversations with my mom. I would tell you this, that if this were 5 years ago, or if this were 10 years ago, I would never have
Mm-mm.
pictured me having these conversations with her where she's not running. Like, she's not running anymore. She's actually sitting and connecting the dots with me. And I think that's probably the most intimate in terms of our relationship we've gotten, because there's a little, even if she's not verbally saying that self accountability there, she's showing that self accountability that's there. But I'll tell you that it's not an easy thing. And I know
No.
families
Right.
and people arrive to that state. They arrive there when they arrive there. Some people, it takes them 30 years, some people, it takes them two. It's
Right.
just
Right.
unfortunate.
Right. We're going to shift gears a bit here Can you share with us some ways and strategies for addressing and healing from generational trauma?
Therapy.
Love it, right?
I'm
Therapy. Let's
like,
say it very clearly. Therapy. So I guess that's
I
inferring that it's best to seek out a
seek
professional or
treat,
support, right?
seek, absolutely seek treatment, seek a professional, seek support. I have that response. The reason why I say that is because my friends, they know when I have conversations with friends of mine and they're saying some things and they're like, I don't, and they're connecting the generational trauma, and I'm like, therapy. don't don't connect it with me. Actually go to therapy. And this week I had an interesting conversation with a trauma client of mine about taking a break from your healing process. Like it's okay to take a break, like it's okay to pause. They were explaining to me how they get very exhausted after sessions. Sometimes it's like I call it an emotional hangover type of
Oh,
feeling,
that's a good term
where
for
it's
it.
just like I can't move, I don't want to do anything. Um, and I told them, it's like, you have the choice to like go at whatever pace you want to go with your trauma, like the healing of your trauma. And they're like, I do. I said, yeah, you do. You have a choice to say, I only can do 2 sessions in a month, and that's it. I can't do every week right now because it's a lot that you're uncovering. And
Right.
I'm just giving this example to
It's
explain
a good
that
example.
the fear that we have in going to therapy. And a lot of times people say, I don't want to have to sit with these emotions. So it's pretty much letting them know that they have the choice to go at whatever pace they want, that lets them realize, like, okay, I do need therapy. And obviously, there's interventions like EMDR,
Mm-hmm.
which really
Mm-hmm.
helps with just identifying new ways of thinking. And then, in addition to that, helping you really reprocess your trauma, which I'm trained in EMDR. And I learned recently too, as well, of IFS, that has a lot of bringing various parts of your personality and yourself across, I think, your developmental trajectory, and then kind of molding who you are as a whole person. Don't really know much about IFS. I've been hearing about it a lot, and it seems very interesting on how it correlates with trauma. And of course, there's CFCBT too as well, which is an additional way in which can actually help you challenge a lot of the beliefs and narratives that unfortunately have been developed for us and we've kind of carried along generations. But in terms of strategies too as well, I think one of the things that's very key, for at least for anyone who is actually doing trauma work, if that makes sense, you have to realize that your trauma is, yeah, it's you're going, if you're using EMDR, you're going to the past, so to speak. You're taking a journey back. You're like, okay, great. I'm reprocessing. Oh, really? I felt abandoned there. And this is why every time people leave, we feel abandoned. Oh, man, my mom does that. And I see those similarities. And oh, I am very anxious. And I have an anxious parent who projected their anxiety on me. And my granddad did the same thing to my mom. And it just, so reprocessing and going back and visiting, that's nice. And once you're going through that process of healing from generational trauma, the client has to get to a point where they start to actually design what their future is going to look like. Because
Right.
the main thing, I would say, like the most important thing to understand about generational trauma is that it can actually end with you.
Yeah.
So that's the
Right.
part that I think that's probably the part of generational trauma that is amazing. Because
Mm-hmm.
you know how we talk about trauma cannot, that we don't like to say the word of trauma being fixed because it's like a lifelong journey that you
Right.
take with you. The thing
Right.
about generational trauma is that there actually is more likelihood that it can end with you. Of course, there's just going to have to be a lot of work that's
Right.
being done.
I like that you're emphasizing that. It's about, eventually just breaking the cycle. It ends with you and not to carry it
Yeah.
forward. And that's one thing I think therapy can be very helpful with that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's talk about how communities and society as a whole can address generational trauma and maybe even help prevent its transmission to future generations. What are you,
Yeah.
what are you thinking about that?
I think I think community also that has to include like the family subsystem, the ecosystem in general.
Yeah.
So that's like
Yeah.
family, church,
Right.
school,
Right.
mosque, wherever. That includes that because the I think the silence and secrecy narrative of generational trauma is what's really killing. Like it's what's really holding it together as strong as it is right now.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the reasons why I say that is we need to start to make changes. These communities need to start making changes to that narrative of, oh, no, that happened to you. No, that did not happen to you. You don't bring that up again. So making these changes helps. I
Mm-hmm.
can give you a quick example. My mom and I, we have this conversation all the time because I feel like this was probably her most transformational woman as a parent, so to speak. I was since I think when I was very young, since maybe like the age of 10, I was very quiet. So very mute to very quiet. So sometimes maybe mute even. And I had like, you know how, I don't know, maybe you don't know actually. So as Christians who go and we go to church and we have uncles and people that we call uncles and
Yes.
aunties, but
Yeah.
really
I have
aren't
that in
your
my
uncles
family.
and
Yeah.
they really aren't your uncles and your aunties.
Right.
So we had
Right.
an uncle who had kind of just noticed me at church just being very mute for like an extended period of time, and then just brought it to my attention and like told my mom rather. Actually, he spoke to me first. Didn't tell me he was going to tell my mom, but spoke to me first. And I was like, yeah, everything's fine. But everything wasn't fine because I was experiencing trauma as a kid. So he
Okay.
then spoke to my mom, and my mom actually listened. She listened to him. He told her she put me in the room. I was like, we're not leaving until we process this, so
Got
to
you.
speak. And of course, that was very helpful because that's when I
Mm-hmm.
knew, like, oh, I can actually speak. There's no silence, so to speak, or secrecy around that. So I think that community is key because a lot of times we
Yes.
see things as community and we don't really say anything. And of course, by doing that, we're easily normalizing it. And that's one thing that we need to be able to do because a lot of times there's this therapist. I'm trying to remember what her Tabitha. I'm going to butcher her name, but it's okay. Tabitha Paramira, like Koguri or something like that. I was watching a video of hers and I found what she said to be just so powerful. She said, because of traditions, we don't question why we do what we do.
Oh,
And I was like, huh,
that's
it's
good.
interesting. And
Right.
I think she likened it to something as little as, oh, that's grandma's recipe. That's how my mom does it. That's how my mom does it. And my mom says, oh, that's how my mom did it.
Right.
But we don't
Right.
really question, even with
Mm-mm.
parenting too, as well. So I found that to be very powerful. And I think that's another way in which, as a community, we can start to really do that. And of course, self accountability, like I said
Yes.
before,
Right. Can't emphasize that
that is
enough.
very needed.
Right. Right. My gosh, Paula, thank you. You just provided so many amazing insights into this very difficult topic.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the hush dynamic. I mean, that this
Yeah.
is really bringing it to light to make people aware, to pay attention to it, and to speak it forward. So I
Yeah,
appreciate everything
absolutely.
you shared
Thank
with
you
us
so
today.
much. Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. And I also want to thank the team behind the podcast, Jason Clayton, Juliana Whitten, and Chris Kelman. Take care, everyone.